The morning Elena Mercer left Hargrove, Illinois, nobody came to see her off. That wasn't self-pity talking. It was just the plain shape of her life at 31 years old. Her landlady, Mrs. Putnam, had slid the eviction notice under the door 3 days prior with a politeness that somehow made it worse, a folded square of paper with Elena's full name written in careful cursive, as though the formality of it softened what it was. The two women who worked alongside Elena at Putnam's laundry had nodded their goodbyes the evening before, uncomfortable in the way people get when they don't know what to say to someone whose luck has run entirely out. And her cousin Harriet, the only family Elena still claimed, had kissed her cheek at Sunday supper and said, "I'm sure something will work out," in the tone people use when they don't believe a word of it. So Elena carried her carpet bag down to the station herself. In the gray hour before full sunrise, her boots clicking on the empty platform boards. She had 43 cents in her coat pocket. She had a train ticket she'd purchased with the last of her savings, the absolute last, the money she'd been keeping tucked inside her left boot for genuine emergencies. She had a newspaper clipping folded so many times the creases had gone soft. She sat on the bench at the far end of the platform and read it again, though she had long since memorized every word. Seeking a woman of sound character and willing disposition to assist in care of 3 children and management of household duties on working cattle ranch located 12 miles outside Caulfield, Montana territory. Widower, age 36. Children ages 11, 8, and 4. Situation urgent. Write or present yourself to C. Whitmore, Box 14, Caulfield. No promises of comfort. No mention of wages beyond board and meals. The word urgent sat in the middle of the notice like a stone dropped in water, and Elena had read enough want ads in her years to know what that word was doing there. It meant the man had already been turned down. It meant this notice had been running for a while. It meant the situation was worse than the careful phrasing let on. She had written to him 6 weeks ago, a short letter, honest to the point of being blunt, because she'd learned that dressing herself up on paper only made the eventual disappointment worse for everyone. I have no experience raising children, but I'm not afraid of work or of hard circumstances. I can cook adequately, manage a household, and I do not frighten easily. I am 31 years old and have no other prospects. She'd almost crossed out that last sentence. She'd left it in. He'd written back in 11 days, which was faster than she'd expected given the distances involved. His handwriting was rough, the pen pressed too hard in places and barely touching the page in others, as though his grip on the thing kept changing. Miss Mercer, your letter was straightforward, and I appreciate that. I won't pretend this is an easy situation. The children have had a difficult year, and the ranch has had worse. If you're willing to make the journey, I will meet you at the Caulfield station on the 15th. C. Whitmore. Not a warm letter, not even a particularly hopeful one, but it was a letter that said come, and that was more than anyone else had said to Elena in a very long time. She'd grown up in Hargrove, the middle child of a furniture maker who died when Elena was 12, leaving behind a wife worn thin with worry and 2 girls who had to learn fast what it meant to get by without much. Her older sister Clara had managed it by marrying well at 17. A merchant's son from a decent family, solid and unexciting, and Clara had stepped into that life like it had been waiting for her all along. Elena had waited for something similar to present itself. It hadn't. She wasn't ugly. She knew that much. She had her mother's dark eyes and her father's stubborn jaw, and she stood straight and looked people in the face when she spoke to them, which some found refreshing and others found unsettling. But she was the sort of plane that people looked past rather than at, and she had a habit of saying what she thought at the wrong moments. And she'd never learned the particular art of softening herself into something more easily digested. 3 times she'd been in something that might have become an arrangement. 3 times it had come to nothing. The last ending when Robert Haynes, a dry goods clerk she'd kept company with for 8 months, told her quietly that his family felt she was not quite what they'd envisioned, which was a way of saying she was nobody from nowhere with no money and no charm to compensate for it. The laundry job had come through Mrs. Putnam's charity more than anything else, and Elena had worked it without complaint for 4 years, 6 days a week, her hands scaling red in the steam and the lye. She'd saved what she could. She'd kept her head down. And then Mrs. Putnam's nephew had come to take over the business, and he'd needed to make cuts, and Elena had been the easiest cut to make. Mrs. Putnam had been sorry. She'd said so, twice, standing in the laundry doorway while Elena collected the few things she kept at the workbench: a pair of heavy gloves, a tin mug, a small bone-handled knife she used to cut rope. "You're a good worker, Elena. I truly am sorry." Elena had thanked her and left. She didn't cry until she was around the corner, and then only for a minute, because she had things to figure out, and crying didn't help you figure things out. She'd spent 2 weeks looking for other work in Hargrove. She'd found nothing. Harriet had let her sleep on the floor of her sitting room with a graciousness that had a time limit Elena could feel approaching. And then she'd found the Caulfield notice at the bottom of the stack of papers she'd been scanning for any possible opening, and she'd sat very still for a long time reading it. Montana Territory. The end of everything mapped. A man she'd never met. 3 children who'd lost their mother. A ranch and some kind of trouble the notice didn't specify. "I am 31 years old and have no other prospects." She'd meant it as a simple statement of fact. Looking back, it was also something like a decision. The train to Caulfield took 2 days with a change in Billings, and Elena spent most of it watching the landscape shift from the flat domesticated fields of Illinois into something rawer and less forgiving. The last stretch of rail ran through country that looked like it hadn't made up its mind about anything. Scrubby hills cutting across open grassland, granite outcrops rising unexpected from the earth, the sky pressing down enormous and cloud-broken. Elena pressed her forehead against the cold window glass and looked at it for a long time. She'd never been further west than Chicago. The woman sitting across from her in the rail car, a stout widow from Billings returning from visiting her daughter, had asked Elena her business, and Elena had told her simply that she was answering a notice. "From a rancher?" The woman's eyebrows had gone up. "Yes." "On your own?" "Yes." The woman had looked at Elena the way people look at someone who doesn't understand what they're getting into. "You have family out here?" "No." "Friends?" "No." A pause. "Well?" The woman had resettled in her seat. "You'll want to hope he's a decent man." "I expect I'll find out soon enough," Elena said, and went back to looking at the window. Caulfield was smaller than she'd anticipated. Most frontier towns were. The idea of them traveled faster than the reality. And the reality of Caulfield in the fall of 1889 was a main street of maybe 30 buildings, a livery, a general store, a saloon with peeling paint on the sign, and a train platform that was more of an extended wooden dock than any proper structure. Elena stepped off the train into a wind that had teeth in it, pulled her coat closer, and stood on the platform with her carpet bag and looked around. There were maybe a dozen people milling about. She didn't know what Caleb Whitmore looked like beyond her own guesses. The rough handwriting had given her the impression of a big man, someone whose hands didn't sit comfortably on a pen. She scanned the platform. He was leaning against the far post with his arms crossed, watching the train. He was tall. That part she'd been right about, with the look of someone who'd spent years doing work that cost him something. Dark hair going gray at the temples, a jaw that needed shaving 3 days ago. His coat was decent but worn at the elbows, and his boots were the boots of a man who didn't buy new ones until the old ones had entirely given up. He was watching the passengers disembark with the expression of someone bracing for disappointment. Elena walked toward him. When she got close enough, he uncrossed his arms and straightened. "Mr. Whitmore." He looked at her. His eyes were gray, the same color as the October sky behind him, and they were careful in the way of someone who'd been surprised badly before. "Miss Mercer." "Yes." A beat of silence. He glanced at her carpet bag, then back at her face. She had the feeling he was making some calculation. "You ate on the train?" he asked. "Some. There's a place on Main Street does a passable beef stew. We should eat before we head out. It's a long ride and I didn't think to bring food." He said it matter-of-factly, already reaching to take her bag without asking, which surprised her. "The buckboard's at the livery." Elena fell into step beside him. "How are the children?" He was quiet for a moment. "Alive," he said, which is more than I could say with confidence 6 months ago. It was such a bleak a thing to say, and he said it so flatly, without reaching for anything softer, that Elena almost stopped walking. She kept pace with him instead and said, "And the ranch?" Still standing, barely, he glanced sideways at her. "I wasn't exaggerating in my letter." I didn't think you were. He nodded once, as though that settled something. They reached the restaurant, a low-ceilinged room that smelled of grease and burned coffee and the particular smell of too many people eating in too small a space. And he held the door and she went in ahead of him, and neither of them felt the need to fill the silence with small talk, which Elena thought was probably a decent sign. They ate across from each other at a table near the window. The stew was exactly as passable as advertised. A woman at the counter glanced at them twice, curious and not bothering to hide it. Caulfield wasn't big enough for strangers not to get noticed. You said in your letter you have no experience with children, Caleb said. He was holding his coffee with both hands and looking at her directly. I want to ask about that. What exactly did you mean? I meant I haven't raised children, Elena said. I have younger cousins I spent time with when we were young. I'm not frightened of them and I'm not impatient by nature, but I won't pretend I know what I'm doing because I don't. Fair enough. He drank his coffee. Maggie, she's the eldest, 11. She's been holding things together in a way no 11-year-old should have to. She'll be polite to you, but don't mistake polite for warm. She's not ready to trust anybody new. That's understandable. Owen's 8. He's... A pause. Something moved across his face and settled. He hasn't spoken much since his mother passed. Not a lot. He talks to the horses more than he talks to people. How long ago did she pass? 14 months. Elena did the arithmetic. The children had been grieving for over a year. And the youngest? Rose. She's 4. Something shifted in his voice on the name, a slight softening he probably didn't realize was there. She was 2 when... She doesn't entirely understand what happened. She asks for her mother sometimes. He set down his coffee cup. That's the hardest part. Elena looked at her stew for a moment. What do you tell her? I tell her Mama's not coming back and that I'm sorry. He said it straight, no decoration. I don't know what else to say. Elena nodded slowly. That's probably the right thing. He looked at her like he hadn't expected that answer. Then he stood up, reached into his coat, and left money on the table. We should go. The light doesn't last, and the road's not great in the dark. Oh, the ride to the ranch took the better part of 2 hours, and the country she'd seen from the train window was even more blunt about itself up close. The hills cutting down to creek beds, the grass gone tawny with the season, cottonwood stands running the low ground, the sky enormous in every direction. Elena had grown up in a country of trees that blocked the distance, and this openness was something she'd have to get used to. It made her feel exposed in a way that wasn't entirely unpleasant. Caleb drove the buckboard and didn't talk much. That was fine. Elena watched the country. There, he said eventually. She looked where he was indicating and saw the ranch in the early dusk. The main house, a large barn, 2 smaller outbuildings, all of it sitting in the fold of a low hill with a creek running below. It was a genuine working spread, she could see that much, big enough to be a serious operation. But something about it looked tired. The fence lines she could see from the road needed work. The barn needed paint. The house itself was solidly built, but the yard around it had gone to weed in a way that spoke less of laziness and more of being overwhelmed. How many cattle? She asked. About 80 head right now. Had 140 2 years ago. He said it without self-pity either, just as a fact. Lost some to weather, sold some when I had to. We've got 2 hands, Burl and Hector. Good workers, but they've got their hands full with the herd. The house and the children have been... He didn't finish that. Have been waiting, Elena said. Yes. The buckboard rolled through the gate and into the yard, and as it did, the door of the house opened. A girl stood in the doorway backlit by lamp glow. 11 years old, Elena figured, though she stood with the self-possession of someone older. She watched the buckboard pull up, and she didn't smile, and she didn't run out to greet them. She just watched. That was Maggie. A smaller shape pushed past her hip. A boy, wiry and solemn, who stopped at the edge of the porch and put his hands in his pockets. Owen. Caleb brought the buckboard to a stop and set the brake and climbed down. He offered his hand up to Elena, and she took it and stepped down, and she turned and looked at the 2 children on the porch, looking back at her. Come say hello, Caleb said. Maggie came down the porch steps with a deliberate evenness, like someone performing an obligation. She was a sharp-featured girl with her father's gray eyes and dark hair braided back, and she looked at Elena with an assessment that was almost professional in its thoroughness. "Hello," she said. Her voice was polite, exactly as polite as her father had described. Nothing more. "Hello, Maggie," Elena said. "I'm Elena." "I know who you are." Owen stayed on the porch. He looked at Elena briefly, then looked at the horse. "Where's Rose?" Caleb asked. "Inside, she fell asleep after supper." Maggie glanced at her father. "Mrs. Bauer came by with bread this afternoon. I told her thank you." "Good girl." He put his hand briefly on her shoulder as he passed her to go up the steps. The gesture was a little stiff, not for lack of caring, Elena thought, but for being out of practice at it. Maggie turned and followed her father inside without another word to Elena. Elena picked up her carpet bag and went up the steps after them. The inside of the house was clean. That was the first thing she noticed. Maggie had been keeping it clean, which must have taken considerable effort for an 11-year-old managing a household. The furniture was heavy and plain, the kind that lasts forever and never looks quite new even when it is. A lamp burned on the table. There was a cold iron smell that meant the stove hadn't been lit for supper, and Elena noticed half a loaf of the bread Maggie had mentioned sitting on the sideboard, and she had the feeling the three of them had made do with that and not said anything about it. "Your room's through there," Caleb said, indicating a door off the main hall. "It's small, but it's got its own window. That's fine. Rose'll probably be up before sunrise. She wanders." He said it like a warning and an apology at once. "I'll be up early anyway." He nodded. Maggie was sitting at the table with her hands folded and her eyes on the tablecloth, and Elena had the feeling the girl was listening to everything without appearing to. Elena looked at the sideboard. "I can heat that bread if you've got butter," she said, "and if there's anything else in the larder I can put something together. I'm not tired." Maggie's eyes came up. She looked at Elena, then at her father. Caleb shrugged. "Larder's behind the stove." Elena found it. Flour, salt, lard, some dried beans, a half-empty jar of molasses, a good heel of salt pork. She built a fire in the stove and started working. Nobody talked much, but Maggie moved to the table and watched her in a way that wasn't hostile, just watchful. Owen had come inside and sat in the corner chair near the window, and he picked at a loose thread on his sleeve and didn't look up, but he didn't leave either. By the time Elena had pan biscuits in the oven and the salt pork crisping in the skillet, the kitchen smelled like something it apparently hadn't in a while, because when she turned around, she found all three of them, Caleb, Maggie, Owen, sitting at the table with the unconscious gravitation of people pulled toward warmth. Caleb had his elbows on the table. Owen had fallen asleep with his cheek on his arms. Maggie watched Elena transfer biscuits to the board and said carefully, "You didn't have to do that." "I know," Elena said. "I was hungry." It wasn't the sort of answer that demanded anything back, and Maggie seemed to understand that, because she didn't say anything else. But she helped set out plates without being asked, and she put Owen's portion aside for morning without needing to be told, and Elena watched her do these things and thought, this child has been running this house alone. Caleb ate quickly and thanked her and went to check the livestock before dark. Maggie cleared the table and banked the stove and showed Elena to her room, a small square of space with a cot, a chest, and a window facing east. With the efficiency of someone who'd been responsible for guests she hadn't invited. At the door she paused. "My mother's name was Catherine," she said. She was looking at a point somewhere past Elena's shoulder. "I'm just telling you so you know." "Thank you for telling me," Elena said. Maggie nodded once and went. Elena sat on the edge of the cot in the dark for a while, still in her coat, listening to the house settle around her. Outside the window, the wind had picked up, a high, thin sound across the grass that was nothing like the Illinois wind she knew. Far off, she could hear cattle. Closer, the sound of Caleb's boots crossing the porch and going around the side of the house. She thought about Catherine Whitmore, whose house this was still, whose chair she'd cooked in, whose children she'd come to care for. She thought about Robert Haynes telling her she wasn't quite what anyone had envisioned. She thought about Maggie's eyes, the way they'd cataloged her at the gate. Then she lay back on the cot, still in her coat because the room was cold, and listened to the wind. And after a while, she slept. What? The first week was the hardest, not for any dramatic reason, but for the relentless ordinariness of it, figuring out where things were, how the stove ran hot on the left side, that the water pump in the yard needed a particular jolt before it cooperated, that Owen fed the horses every morning at first light and considered it his unspoken territory, that Maggie reviewed the household accounts on Friday afternoons at the kitchen table with the seriousness of a bank clerk and would tell you what they needed from town in order of priority without being asked. Elena learned these things by watching and by making mistakes and by asking when asking was necessary. She asked Maggie where the mending was kept, and Maggie showed her without warmth, but without coldness either. She asked Caleb what he needed most from the house during the day, and he said, after a pause, supper. The children fed. Everything else is less important. She asked Owen directly on the fourth day if he wanted to show her how he fed the horses, and he'd looked at her sideways for a long moment before giving a single nod. And she'd followed him to the barn and watched while he worked and said nothing at all, because he wasn't offering conversation, and she didn't reach for what wasn't offered. On the fifth morning, she found Rose. She'd heard the child get up. She slept lightly, always had, and followed the small sound of bare feet across the floorboards to the kitchen, where she found a 4-year-old girl in a nightgown standing in front of the cold stove with her arms crossed over her chest in an attitude of immense seriousness. Rose was blonde, unlike the others, with her mother's coloring maybe, a round-faced, solemn child who turned when Elena appeared in the doorway and regarded her without alarm. "The fire went out," Rose said. "It did," Elena agreed. "It does that overnight. Mama used to start it again." Elena was very still for a moment. "I can start it again," she said. "If you want to watch, you can." Rose watched. When the fire was going and Elena was warming milk on the stove, Rose climbed onto the bench beside the table and folded her hands the way children do when they're trying to be very grown up, and said, "Are you going to stay?" Elena looked at her. "I'm planning to." "Maggie says we'll see." "That's fair," Elena said. "We will see." Rose seemed to think this over. "I like your hair," she offered finally. "It's the color of the creek mud." Elena laughed. It came out surprised and real, and Rose looked briefly pleased with herself, and Elena thought, there you are. Not in a sentimental way, not as some moment of easy connection that solved anything, but in the way of recognizing a person who is starting to exist to you, the particular way that happens with children when they stop being a concept and become someone specific. She poured the warm milk and set it in front of Rose, and she got the bread and the butter, and they sat together in the early kitchen while the fire built itself back up. And outside, the Montana dawn came in gray and cold through the window, and the ranch slowly woke around them, and Elena Mercer was still there, which was, for now, the only thing she'd promised anyone. She intended to keep it. The second week was when Elena understood how bad things actually were. Not the grief. She had seen that coming, had braced for it on the train ride out, and found it exactly where she'd expected. What she hadn't anticipated was the way the grief had grown into the ranch itself, worked itself into the fence posts and the account books and the daily rhythm of the place like rotworks into old timber. Invisible until you put weight on it and feel the give. She found the accounts by accident. Maggie had left the ledger open on the kitchen table one Friday afternoon and gone outside to call Owen in for supper, and Elena, carrying a pot from the stove, had glanced down at it without intending to, and then she'd stopped and looked properly, and the numbers sat there in Maggie's careful 11-year-old handwriting, telling a story that had no good ending written into it yet. They were behind on the note to the Caulfield Bank. Not catastrophically, not yet, but the margin was thinner than it should have been after a full season's work, and Elena could see in the columns where the shortfall had started, last winter, when they'd lost 14 head to a cold snap that had come in too fast and too hard. And Caleb had sold another 20 in the spring at prices that weren't what they should have been because he'd needed the cash quickly and the buyers had known it. 2 months of hired hand wages to a man named Cooper who'd left in July with no notice. There was a line in the accounts just labeled Cooper, gone, with the amount and nothing else. And Elena could feel the particular bitterness in the blankness of that entry. She closed the ledger and moved it to the side of the table and didn't say anything about it to Maggie when she came back in. She said it to Caleb that evening instead, after the children were in bed because it needed saying. He was sitting at the table with his own coffee gone cold beside him, looking at nothing in particular. When she came in and sat across from him, he looked up with the expression of a man who's used to conversations that bring more problems than they solve. "I saw the accounts," she said. He didn't ask how. Then you know. I know you need another hand and can't afford one. I know the south fence needs work or you'll be chasing cattle off Garrett land again in the spring. I know you're about 4 months from the bank having a conversation you don't want to have. She said it without apology and without drama because neither would help him. What I don't know is whether there's anything I can do about the second two. Caleb was quiet for a moment. He had his hands wrapped around the cold coffee cup, not drinking it, just holding it. The south fence I can work on Sundays if the weather holds. Garrett's been patient so far, but he won't be forever. A pause. The bank is... He stopped. Started again. I had a plan when I came out here. Catherine and I both did. It was a good plan. And then she got sick and the plan didn't account for that, and now here we are. He said it without bitterness, which somehow made it harder to hear than bitterness would have. Can you sell to make up the gap? Elena asked. Not at fall prices. I'd be selling cheap into a buyer's market and I'd spend all winter trying to rebuild the herd. He pushed the cup away. If we get through winter with the herd intact and I can get decent prices in the spring, we're all right. If anything else goes wrong... He didn't finish that sentence. He'd probably finished it too many times already in his own head. Elena nodded. She stood up and took his cold coffee cup and poured it out and refilled it from the pot on the stove and set it back in front of him. He looked at the steam rising from it for a moment. Thank you, he said. It sounded like he meant more than the coffee. I can take some of the supply runs, she said. Save you time. And I can look at whether we're spending more than we need to on things in the house. You're not here to fix the finances. I'm here to help the household run, Elena said. The finances are part of that. He didn't argue. She took that as agreement and went to bed. The thing about the children was that they each needed something different, and none of them knew how to ask for it. Maggie needed to be needed. She'd organized her grief into usefulness, and she'd been running on that ever since. And the danger was that if you tried to take the usefulness away from her, if you said, sit down, I'll handle this, you're a child, you took away the only structure keeping her upright. Elena understood this because she'd done the same thing at 12 when her father died, had kept herself busy every waking hour because idle time let in things she couldn't manage. So she didn't try to shoulder Maggie out of her responsibilities. She worked alongside her instead. They developed a rhythm without planning one. Elena made breakfast. Maggie managed the younger children's washing and dressing, which she'd been doing for over a year and considered hers. Elena handled the cooking and the heavier cleaning. Maggie kept the accounts and helped with mending. When they worked in the same room, they talked sometimes. Practical things at first, then gradually less practical. What they needed from town. Whether the windowsill in the front room had always leaked like that or only since last winter. Whether Owen was eating enough. He eats more when you make the cornbread, Maggie said one morning, looking at the bread Elena was cutting. She said it the way she said most things, as information, nothing attached to it. I'll make it more often then, Elena said. Maggie was quiet. Then, he doesn't mean to be difficult. He just doesn't know how to be around people right now. I know. Elena glanced at her. He's not difficult. He's just quiet. Papa says he'll talk when he's ready. Your papa's probably right. Maggie looked down at her hands for a moment. What if he's not? It was the first genuinely frightened thing Elena had heard from her, and it came out small and careful, the way something precious gets handled. Elena set down the bread knife. Then we figure that out when it comes to it, she said. But I don't think that's where this is headed. How do you know? Because he talks to the horses, Elena said. Someone who's truly gone quiet stops doing that too. He's still talking, Maggie. He's just choosing who he talks to. Maggie thought about this for a long time. She didn't say whether she found it reassuring, but she didn't dismiss it either, and that was something. Owen was 9 weeks away from turning 9 when Elena arrived, and he was a mystery she approached the way you approach a skittish animal, without sudden movements, without demands, giving him space to decide on his own terms. He was not a difficult child. He was a child in mourning who had learned that showing grief made the adults around him look alarmed, and alarmed adults made things worse, so he'd stopped showing it. He did his chores without complaint. He was gentle with Rose in an unself-conscious way that spoke of long habit. He watched Elena from the corners of rooms and from across yards, the the way a very careful person watches someone new in their space. She started leaving him alone in the barn when he fed the horses. She'd come in on some errand, a tool she needed, a check on the tack, and she'd nod to him and he'd nod back and she'd do what she came for and leave. After 2 weeks of this, she came in one morning and found him talking in a low voice to the bay mare Juniper, while he combed out her mane, and she stopped in the doorway and listened without meaning to. "Don't know why she keeps making the beans that way," he was saying. "Maggie says it's because we were out of salt pork, but I think she just does them different." A pause while Juniper shifted her weight. "They're not bad," he admitted. "I didn't say they were bad." Elena stepped back out of the doorway before he heard her and went back to the house. That evening at supper, she said to no one in particular, "I've been doing the beans wrong. I think I need more time with the salt pork than I've been giving it. Does anyone know how long your mother cooked it before she put the beans in?" There was a silence. Maggie looked at her plate. Rose was pushing a bean around with her spoon. Then Owen said, not loudly, "About an hour?" She'd start it when she put the bread on. Everyone at the table was very still for a moment. Elena nodded like it was an ordinary conversation. "That makes sense. I'll try that next time." She picked up her fork. "Thank you." Owen's ears went red. He looked at his plate. But he'd said it, and it had been answered, and nothing bad had happened, and Elena watched him in her peripheral vision quietly eat the rest of his supper. After that, he talked a little more. Not a flood. Nothing so dramatic. Just incrementally more, the way the temperature rises in spring, too slowly to pinpoint, but enough that one day you realize your coat isn't as necessary as it was. Rose was the easiest and the hardest at once. She was easy because she was 4 and 4-year-olds are largely uncomplicated in their needs. Warmth, food, attention, someone to sit with when the dark felt too large. She'd attached to Elena with the directness of small children who don't see the point in circling something they've already decided about. By the 3rd week, she was appearing at Elena's elbow at odd hours of the day, asking questions that had no particular logic to their sequence. Why did butter go soft? How did birds know where to fly? Could you make a hat out of a potato sack? What did Elena's house look like before this one? "I didn't have one," Elena told her. "I lived in a room at a lady's house. Did you have any children?" "No." "Did you want some?" Elena had paused over the bread she was kneading. "I didn't think much about it. I think you would have been good at it," Rose said, with the absolute confidence of someone who has not yet learned to be uncertain about her opinions. She was hard because of the moments that came without warning, the moments when she'd stop in the middle of something and say, clearly and without distress in her voice but with all of it behind her eyes, "Where's Mama?" Not in the way that expected an answer, not anymore. Just a thing she said when the absence made itself felt again, the way you might mention a toothache to the room, not asking for anything, just noting that it was still there. Elena never tried to redirect her or rush past it. She'd say, "She's not here, sweetheart," and Rose would nod with the gravity of someone processing something much too large for a 4-year-old's understanding, and then she'd go back to whatever she'd been doing. Caleb had told her he said she's not coming back, and Elena understood why he'd chosen that phrasing. The directness of it, the refusal to dress it in something false. But she could see it landing harder on Rose than probably intended, and she adjusted. Not a lie, just something a little more spacious. Caleb noticed. She wasn't sure when, exactly. He was a man who observed more than he spoke, which she'd understood by the end of the 1st week. But one evening when Rose had had a difficult hour before bed, and Elena had sat with her and talked her through it, and then had come back out to find Caleb still up in the kitchen, he'd looked at her and said, "You're good with her." "She's a good kid," Elena said. "I mean it." He wasn't looking at her sentimentally. That wasn't his way. He was looking at her the same way he looked at things he was trying to figure out the dimensions of. "I was worried about Rose most. She doesn't—" He stopped, tried again. "She doesn't have the language for what happened to her. Maggie can put words to it. Owen has it somewhere inside him, even if it doesn't come out. But Rose just—" He made a motion with his hand. "She's carrying something, and she can't name it." "Most people are like that," Elena said. "Not just 4-year-olds. He looked at her. Something in his face shifted slightly, not toward warmth exactly, but toward something less guarded. "That's probably true." She didn't push the moment anywhere. She poured herself a glass of water and said goodnight and went to bed. And she thought about the way he'd said I was worried about Rose most. The past tense of it was, like it was beginning to resolve into something else. There were bad days? She wouldn't pretend there weren't. There was the morning 3 weeks in when she burned the biscuits because she'd been up before 4 with Rose and hadn't slept enough to track the stove properly. And Caleb had come in from morning work hungry and found a plate of charcoal, and she'd seen him work to keep his face neutral, and it had made her furious at herself in a way that was also about every other failure she'd carried into this place. She threw the biscuits out and made cornmeal mush instead, and nobody said anything at breakfast. And afterward, she sat in the cold pantry for 5 minutes and breathed until the feeling passed. There was the afternoon Owen knocked a full bucket of clean water off the porch railing. She never knew how. And the water went across the clean laundry she'd just hung out, and she'd said something sharp, and he'd gone white and silent in a way that cracked her in half, and she'd had to go after him and say, "I'm sorry, that was my temper talking, not you," which was a hard thing to say to a child who still looked uncertain whether to believe her. He'd believed her, eventually. It had taken him 2 days of extra wariness, which she'd weathered without pressing him. And then he'd come in one afternoon and set a handful of creek stones on the kitchen table, smooth flat ones, the kind you can skip, and said, without context, "I found these. I thought you might want them." She'd looked at the stones. She'd looked at him. "Thank you, Owen." He'd nodded and left. The stones sat on the kitchen windowsill after that, and she never moved them. There was the Saturday that a woman from town came by, Vera Goddard, wife of the man who ran the general store, with the air of someone performing a charitable call. And she'd looked Elena up and down on the porch with barely disguised assessment and said to Caleb, "We heard you'd taken on a woman from Illinois. I didn't realize she was quite so..." And then she'd smiled and not finished the sentence. And Elena had stood on her own porch with her hands folded and her face arranged into pleasantness and thought things she didn't say. "Miss Mercer has been invaluable," Caleb said. He said it flatly, not like a compliment, more like a correction. Vera Goddard smiled again with her teeth and asked after the children and left without coming inside. And when the wagon was down the road, Caleb glanced at Elena and said, "Don't worry about her." "I'm not worried about her," Elena said, and meant it. She'd met Vera Goddard in 100 different forms in Hargrove, Illinois, and she'd learned a long time ago that women like that were only frightening if you were trying to gain their approval, which she wasn't. Caleb looked at her for a moment. "No," he said, "I don't think you are." He went back to work. The south fence got done in 3 Sundays. Elena didn't ask to help with it. She just showed up on the second Sunday with a pair of gloves and a post pounder, and Caleb looked at her and apparently decided not to waste time arguing about it. Burl, the older of the 2 ranch hands, a weathered man of 50-something who had the speech economy of someone who'd lived alone too long, watched her work for a few minutes and then handed her a pair of proper pliers without comment, which was the closest thing to a compliment she got from him for several weeks. She learned the fence. She learned the creek crossing and the south pasture and the low ground where the cattle liked to drift in summer. She learned that Hector, the younger hand, was 22 and homesick for New Mexico and kept a photograph of his mother in his shirt pocket that he'd touch sometimes without knowing he was doing it. She learned that Caleb could work 14 hours without complaint, but went brittle in a particular way when he was tired. Not mean, never mean, just compressed. All the words shorter and more careful, like a man managing something under pressure. She didn't try to fix that. She just made sure there was food when he came in and left him alone with his coffee until the compression eased. The ranch didn't transform. That was the thing about it. Nothing she did was dramatic. She patched the places that were coming apart, made sure the children ate, kept the stove going, managed the supplies tighter than they'd been managed, and showed up every day whether she felt like it or not, because that was what you did when people were counting on you. Maggie was the first one who said anything direct about it. It was a Sunday in November, the first real cold snap of the season, and they were in the kitchen together working on a quilt. Or rather, Maggie was working on a quilt, and Elena was learning to work on a quilt, which was different and involved several mistakes, and Maggie correcting them with the combination of patience and precision she brought to everything. "You didn't leave," Maggie said. She was looking at her stitching. "I said I wasn't planning to." "Other people said that." A pause. The needle went in and came out. "The woman who came before you, she lasted 8 days, and there was a woman Mrs. Garrett sent over to help after Mama died. She stayed 3 weeks." A longer pause. People say they're staying all the time. They don't always mean it. Elena kept her eyes on her own stitching, which was crooked in a way she'd have to redo. I meant it. Why? It was a genuine question, not a challenge, not suspicion. Just a child who had been disappointed enough times that she needed to understand the reason behind the thing. Because the reason told you whether to trust it. Elena thought about it honestly. Because there's nowhere else I'm supposed to be, she said. I've spent a lot of years in places that weren't quite right. This isn't easy, but it feels, she searched for the word. It feels like something that matters, and I haven't had that in a long time. Maggie was quiet for a while. She finished a row and started another. My mother used to say a thing, she said finally. She said the best things don't come ready-made. You have to build them. Elena looked up at her. Maggie was looking at her stitching. Her face was careful and composed and 11 years old and older than that all at once. She sounds like she was very wise, Elena said. She was, Maggie said. She was also wrong about a lot of things, but she was wise. It was the first time Maggie had spoken about her mother to Elena with anything other than a formal mention of her name, the first time she'd offered her as a real person with complicated dimensions rather than a fact to be noted and set aside. Elena understood what it cost her, and she didn't make it into a moment by saying too much about it. She just nodded and went back to her stitching. Later, Maggie looked over at it and said, You're going to have to pull that whole section. The tension's wrong. I know, Elena said. I can show you again. I'd appreciate that. And Maggie showed her, and Elena unpicked the bad stitches, and outside the window the first real snow of the Montana winter came down in fat flakes that stuck to the glass. And in the front room they could hear Rose narrating an elaborate story to her rag doll. And somewhere out near the barn, Owen's voice drifted up briefly, talking to Juniper, or maybe to Hector, it was hard to tell. And the stove ticked steadily in the corner, and it was not a perfect afternoon. And nobody in that kitchen would have claimed it was. But something was building in it, quiet and imperfect and real. Elena pulled her bad stitches out one by one and started again. Winter passed the way hard things do. Not quickly, not gently, but with a kind of stubborn persistence that eventually became its own form of proof. You got through it because you kept getting up. By the time the snow retreated from the lower pastures in March, and the creek ran high and loud with melt, the Whitmore Ranch had changed in ways that were difficult to point to directly, but impossible to miss if you knew what it had looked like before. The fence lines were solid. The larder had been managed well enough that they'd come through the cold months without the kind of desperate shortfall that had threatened the previous winter. The children had color in their faces again. And the house, which had carried the particular silence of a place where people were surviving rather than living, had gotten louder in the way that means something good. Rose's running feet on the floorboards, Owen arguing with Maggie about whose turn it was to haul water, the sound of someone laughing at something that wasn't particularly funny, but got laughed at anyway, because the mood allowed it. Elena had not caused all of this. She was careful not to think of it that way, because that kind of thinking led to the sort of pride that made people careless. The ranch had steadied because Caleb had held it together through sheer will for 14 months before she arrived, because Burl and Hector showed up every morning and did the work, because Maggie had kept the accounts and the household running with a diligence that would have impressed most adults. Elena had filled a gap, several gaps, but she hadn't built anything from nothing. She'd stepped into an existing structure and helped shore it up, and there was a difference. Still, something had shifted. She felt it in small ways. Maggie had started saving Elena a portion of whatever she was eating if Elena wasn't in the kitchen at mealtimes, without being asked. Owen had begun telling her things, not personal things, not yet, but practical things, observations. That Juniper was favoring her left foreleg slightly, that he'd seen cattle on the East Ridge that might be Garrett's strays, that the cellar door hinge was going to give if someone didn't look at it soon. He said these things the way he might tell his father, which meant he'd filed Elena into the category of people whose attention was worth having, and she didn't make a fuss about it because making a fuss would have embarrassed him and possibly undone it. And Rose had stopped asking where her mother was with that particular quality of resignation in her voice. She still mentioned Catherine. Mama used to do it this way. Mama liked the blue cups better. But it had changed from an open wound being touched repeatedly to something more like a way of keeping someone present in the room, which was different, which was healthier. Caleb was the hardest to read, and Elena had mostly stopped trying to read him directly, and instead paid attention to the things that changed around the edges. He ate more. He slept better. She knew this because she was a light sleeper and she'd spent months aware of the sound of him moving around the house at 2 and 3 in the morning, the particular footfall of someone who can't stay unconscious. And by February, that had diminished to something occasional rather than nightly. He'd started talking to Burl and Hector in the yard again, with what sounded like actual conversation rather than instruction giving. And once, in late January, Elena had heard him laugh at something Hector said. A real laugh, short and unprepared, as though it had escaped before he could decide whether to allow it. He didn't talk to Elena much more than he had at the beginning, but the texture of the silence between them had changed. It was less like two strangers being careful and more like two people who'd worked alongside each other long enough to be comfortable without filling the air. Spring came, and with it, the town's attention. Elena had been aware of Caulfield watching since the beginning. It was too small a place for anything to happen without everyone having an opinion about it. But through the winter, distance and cold had kept most of that at arm's length. The occasional comment from someone at the general store. Vera Goddard's tight smiles when Elena came in for supplies. A few looks in the street that she'd learned to receive without reacting to. The way you learn to receive wind. But spring opened things up, and with the warmer weather came more traffic on the road past the ranch. More occasions when Elena was visible in town. More opportunities for Caulfield to form its views. The first indication that those views were organizing themselves into something deliberate came on a Tuesday in April when Elena brought the wagon into town for supplies and found Vera Goddard and two other women, Margaret Fitch, whose husband ran the bank, and a woman named Clara Pruitt, whose family owned half the good grazing land east of the creek, standing outside the general store in the particular arrangement of people who've been talking about something and haven't quite finished. They stopped when Elena pulled the wagon up. Vera smiled with the full machinery of her face. "Miss Mercer, we were just saying we hadn't seen you in a while." "I've been out to the ranch mostly," Elena said. She climbed down and tied off the horse. "Of course." Vera glanced at the others. "How are the children?" "We worry about them, you know, losing their mother so young." "They're well," Elena said. "Growing." "That's lovely." Margaret Fitch had a way of agreeing with things that made the agreement feel like an indictment. "And Mr. Whitmore? He must be so relieved to have someone to manage things." Elena picked up her list. "If you'll excuse me." She went into the store. Behind her she heard the murmur of them resuming, and even without hearing the specific words she understood the shape of the conversation. The particular concern that sounded like concern but wasn't, the careful question about whether it was quite appropriate for a single woman to be living out on a man's property. The wonderings about the children being raised by someone with no real connection to the family. She'd heard conversations like that conducted about other people her whole life. She'd just never been the subject of one. She bought what she needed and loaded the wagon and drove back to the ranch and didn't mention it, but it didn't stop. By May, there were rumors in rotation around Caulfield. She heard them third hand through Hector, who'd heard them at the saloon, which in a town that size functioned as the primary news distribution mechanism. The rumors were various and not entirely coherent, that Elena had misrepresented herself in her letter to Caleb, that she had a past in Illinois that didn't bear scrutiny, that she was managing the ranch finances to benefit herself, that she had driven away the previous women who'd tried to help because she wanted to be the only one, that the children were being neglected in ways that didn't show on the surface. None of these things were true. Most of them were contradictory. That didn't matter. What mattered was that they were circulating, and that the people circulating them had reach. "People are going to talk," Caleb said, when she finally told him about it. He was fixing the cellar door hinge Owen had flagged, a project that had apparently waited until the hinge started squealing audibly before becoming urgent. He didn't stop working while he talked. They talked when Catherine was alive. They talked when she died. They'll talk about something else in 6 months. "I know," Elena said. She was holding the door steady while he worked. "I just thought you should know what's being said." "Does it bother you?" She considered that honestly. "Some of it does," she said. "The parts about the children, someone suggesting they're being neglected." She stopped. "That one bothers me." Caleb set down the screwdriver and looked at her. "Those children are not neglected." "I know that. Anyone who spent 5 minutes in this house knows that." He picked the screwdriver back up. Vera Goddard hasn't been inside this house in 2 years. Margaret Fitch has never been inside it. I know, Elena said again. I'm not asking you to do anything about it. I just wanted you to know. He was quiet for a moment. The hinge went in. He tested the door twice. It moved cleanly and without noise, and stood up and put his tools away and said, I'll talk to Fitch. You don't have to. I have a note at his bank, Caleb said with the simple logic of a man who understands where power actually lives. He'll listen. She didn't know if he did talk to Fitch. Things didn't stop exactly, but they shifted slightly, became less about Elena specifically, and more about the broader question of the Whitmore family, their situation, their fitness, the propriety of various arrangements. Which was a different kind of attack, but she was starting to understand that it was the same people behind it. Mustn't. What she hadn't anticipated was how the children would respond to it. Maggie heard things at school. She was old enough to catch the adult conversations filtering down through the children who repeated them without understanding they were weapons. And she came home one afternoon in May with her face arranged in the flat, careful expression she wore when she was working very hard to keep something inside. Elena was in the kitchen. She saw Maggie's face and didn't ask immediately, letting the girl come to it in her own time, which she did at the supper table after the younger children had eaten and gone to do their evening chores. Judith Fitch said, her mother said you were only here because you wanted the ranch when Papa died, Maggie said. She was looking at the table. Her voice was steady in the way a person's voice is steady when they've practiced being steady. She said you had no real interest in us. Elena was quiet for a moment. What did you say to Judith? She asked. Maggie looked up. I said she didn't know what she was talking about. How'd that go over? Not great. The briefest crack of something wry in Maggie's expression. We're not speaking now. I'm sorry about that. I'm not, Maggie said. She's wrong. A pause. She is wrong. Yes, Elena said. She is. Maggie looked at her for a long moment. The full, assessing look she'd given Elena that first night on the porch. The look that took everything in and weighed it. Then she nodded once, the same decisive nod that meant she'd reached a conclusion, and picked up her plate and brought it to the basin and started washing it. I know she's wrong, Maggie said again to the window above the basin. I just wanted to hear you say it. You can ask me things directly, Elena said. You always could. Maggie glanced back at her. I know, I'm just... She stopped, tried again. I used to ask my mother things, and she'd always know, and then she didn't know anything anymore, and I couldn't ask her, and I stopped. Another stop, the hands in the basin. I'm still getting used to asking people things. Elena didn't say anything to that. There wasn't anything to say. She got up and stood beside Maggie and started drying the dishes Maggie was washing, and they worked in silence until the basin was empty, and that was enough. Owen heard things too, but what reached him was rougher. There were 3 boys in Caulfield who had the particular meanness of boys whose fathers are important enough that they've never had to apologize for anything. They found Owen in the street one Saturday when Elena had brought him into town to pick up a parcel, and she'd been inside the postal office when it happened. And by the time she came out with the parcel, Owen was standing very still on the boardwalk with his jaw set and his fists at his sides. And the 3 boys were walking away making some comment she couldn't entirely hear. She looked at Owen. His ear was red in a way that said someone had cuffed him. What happened? She asked. Nothing, he said. She waited. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, They said you were making Papa give you the ranch, that you'd lied about everything and you were going to take it from us. Elena looked at the 3 boys disappearing around the corner. She kept her voice even. And the ear? Owen's jaw tightened. I told them they were liars. She thought about several things to say and chose the one that was true. You were right, they are. I know. Come on. She picked up the parcel. Let's go home. They drove back to the ranch mostly quiet, which was their normal, but at some point on the road, Owen said, without preamble, They don't know you. No, Elena agreed. People talk about things they don't know, he said. It came out like something someone had told him, or maybe like something he'd figured out and was stating for the first time as a principal. They do, Elena said. It's one of the least useful things people do. Owen looked out at the passing country. Papa knows you, he said. We know you. Something tightened in Elena's chest, brief and pressured, and she kept her eyes on the road. Yes, she said. You do. He didn't say anything else about it. She didn't either. But she filed away what he'd said in the part of her mind where she kept things that mattered too much to look at directly. June brought heat and the particular busyness of a working ranch in summer, and for a while the pressure from town receded under the weight of everything that needed doing. Caleb brought the herd down from the upper pastures, and the spring count was better than it had been the year before. Not where it had been before Catherine's death, not yet, but headed in the right direction, which was more than he'd been able to say in a while. He'd negotiated a better arrangement with the bank. Fitch, whatever Caleb had said to him, had extended the terms with less resistance than before. The south fence held. Elena had started keeping a kitchen garden in the patch of ground behind the house. It was practical more than anything. Fresh vegetables reduced what they needed from town. But Rose had appointed herself its official guardian and took this responsibility with the complete seriousness she brought to everything she decided was hers. She could tell you at any given moment exactly which plants were doing well and which weren't, and she had strong opinions about the slugs, which she considered a personal affront. It was in the garden, a Tuesday morning in late June, that Caleb found Elena and Rose arguing amiably about whether the beans were ready to pick yet. They're not, Rose said. Some of them are, Elena said. Not those ones. Rose pointed with authority. Those ones are still thinking about it. Beans don't think, Owen called from across the yard without looking up from what he was doing. You don't know that, Rose said. Caleb stopped at the garden edge, watching them. Elena glanced up and saw him standing there with his hat in his hands and an expression she couldn't immediately read. Something quiet and complicated, not sad exactly, but close to something. What? She asked. He shook his head. Nothing. He looked at Rose. Don't eat the ones that are still thinking. I won't, Rose said seriously. He went on across the yard toward the barn, and Elena watched him go, and she thought about that expression for the rest of the morning without finding a clean name for it. The organized opposition, when it came through Nora Clement. Nora Clement was perhaps 60, the widow of a man who'd run the land records office for 20 years before dying and leaving her well-positioned in the town's social architecture. She was not as openly hostile as Vera Goddard, which made her more dangerous. She had the kind of influence that moved quietly through channels, a word to the minister, a mention at the Women's Society meeting, a concern shared with a county official over dinner. She'd been watching the Whitmore situation, as she called it, since before Elena arrived, and she'd arrived at a position. She came to the ranch on a Thursday in early July, alone, in a neat black buggy, and she asked for Caleb at the door with the manner of someone making a formal call. Elena let her in and went to find Caleb, and she stayed in the kitchen where she could hear through the door, which she left open enough. The county has a process for situations like this, Nora Clement said. Her voice was measured and not unkind in its surface register. When children are being raised in irregular circumstances. My children are being raised in their home, Caleb said, by a woman who has no legal connection to them, no contractual arrangement, no formal standing. A pause. I ask because I care about those children, Caleb. I've known your family for years. I knew Catherine. Then you know Catherine would have wanted them raised here. What Catherine would have wanted and what is proper under the county code are two different questions. The sound of a chair being settled into. I'm not your enemy. I want to help you formalize whatever arrangement you have with this woman so that no one can raise questions about it later. That's all I'm suggesting. What kind of questions? Caleb's voice had gone flat. Questions about whether she's suited to be raising 3 children, whether the situation is appropriate, whether the children might benefit from a more structured arrangement. A careful beat. Judge Harlan from the county seat has agreed to make a visit, just to satisfy himself that everything is in order. That should be nothing to worry about if everything truly is in order. In the kitchen, Elena stood very still with her hand on the kitchen table. Caleb said, When? 2 weeks. A long pause. Then Caleb said, in the same flat voice, I'd like you to leave now, Mrs. Clement. She left. When Caleb came into the kitchen, he looked at Elena and she looked at him, and neither of them pretended she hadn't heard. "A judge," she said. "It might be nothing." She looked at him steadily. "Is that what you think?" He didn't answer that. He sat down at the kitchen table and put his hands flat on the wood and looked at them. "I'll talk to Alderman." That was the man in Caulfield who served as closest thing to a lawyer in a town that size, a retired county clerk who'd handled various legal matters for various ranchers over the years. "Good," Elena said.
Elena. He said her name in a way he hadn't before, not as a way of starting a sentence, but as though the name itself was the thing he was trying to say. He looked up at her. "I should have—" He stopped, the hands on the table. "I should have paid more attention to what was being said in town. I thought it would run its course." "You had other things to pay attention to," she said. "That's not an excuse." "No," she agreed, "but it's a reason." He looked at her for another moment. Then he stood up and went to find Alderman, and Elena stayed in the kitchen and thought about what a judge's visit meant and what it could become. And she thought about Rose asking if she was going to stay, and about Owen's stones on the windowsill, and about Maggie learning to ask questions again. She was still standing in the kitchen when Maggie came home from school, let in the back door, dropped her things on the bench, and stopped when she saw Elena's face. "What happened?" Maggie asked. Elena looked at her, at this girl who had been managing things since she was 10 years old, who had buried her mother and kept the accounts, and corrected Elena's quilting stitches, and defended her to a school friend without hesitation. "Someone's trying to make things difficult for us," Elena said. "She used us without planning to. A county judge is coming to look at the situation in 2 weeks. Maggie's face went through several things quickly. "Because of you being here. Yes. Because people think—" Maggie stopped. Her jaw set in the exact way her father's did. "That's not fair." "No," Elena said. "It isn't." Maggie stood in the kitchen doorway with her schoolbooks in her arms and that set jaw, and she looked older than 11, and also exactly 11. And Elena felt the particular fear that comes not from your own danger, but from someone else's. The fear of watching children you've come to love standing in the path of something that shouldn't be able to touch them. "Can they take us away?" Maggie asked. Direct. No softening. Elena met her eyes. "They're going to try." The words cost her something to say. But Maggie wasn't a child who could be protected by comfortable lies, and she never had been, and treating her as if she were would only make everything worse. Maggie absorbed it with the stillness she'd developed over 14 months of absorbing things. And then she set her books down on the bench and walked past Elena to the stove and put the kettle on. "Then we need to be ready," she said. It was so straightforward, so matter-of-fact in the way Maggie was matter-of-fact about everything. The fence needs work, the beans aren't ready, the hinge is going to give, that Elena almost laughed. She didn't. She went and stood beside Maggie, and they waited for the kettle together. And outside, Owen came across the yard with a load of firewood, and Rose trotted beside him, describing something at length, while he listened with the patience he kept for the things he loved. The 2 weeks would pass. The judge would come. And whatever happened then, Elena thought, it would not find this family unprepared. She had made a promise, not out loud to anyone, not even to herself in any formal way. Just the quiet, ongoing fact of it, like the stones on the windowsill, like the kettle starting to sing, like the sound of those 2 children coming across the yard toward home. She wasn't going anywhere. Alderman's name was George, and he worked out of a back room behind the feed store that smelled of sawdust and old paper, with ledgers stacked on every horizontal surface and a single window that let in approximately enough light to read by if you positioned yourself correctly. He was 63, bald in the way of men who lost their hair young and had long since made peace with it. And he'd spent 20 years as a county clerk before his knees gave out on him, and he'd settled in Caulfield to do what legal work a small frontier town required, which was mostly land disputes and the occasional contract. Caleb had known him for 6 years. Elena met him for the first time on a Friday evening, sitting across from him in his cluttered back room while he read through the letter Nora Clement had apparently also sent to the county seat, a copy of which, through means Alderman didn't specify, he'd managed to obtain. "She's thorough," Alderman said, setting the letter down. He said it without admiration and without condemnation, the way you'd note the weather. "What does it say?" Caleb asked. "That the minor children of one Caleb Whitmore, widower,
are being raised in circumstances of uncertain propriety by an unrelated woman of unverified character, and that the county ought to satisfy itself that appropriate arrangements are in place for their welfare. Alderman folded the letter. Judge Harlan is Nora Clement's second cousin once removed, which is the sort of thing that technically doesn't matter and practically matters considerably. Elena looked at the folded letter. What does a judge's visit actually look like? He comes to the property, speaks to the children, to Caleb, possibly to you, speaks to people in town who have views on the matter. Alderman laced his fingers on the desk. He then has the authority, if he determines the situation is not in the children's best interests, to issue an order. What kind of order? Caleb said. Alderman was quiet for a moment. In the most serious case, one that requires Miss Mercer to vacate the property within a specified period, and that places the children under formal county supervision until a suitable permanent arrangement is established, which, in practical terms, could mean the orphanage in Billings while a more formal guardianship is arranged. The word orphanage sat in the room like something dropped from a height. Caleb's face didn't change, but Elena saw his hands go still on the arms of the chair. On what grounds, he said very carefully, can a judge determine that 3 children living in their own home with their own father are better served by an orphanage in Billings? Technically, on the grounds that the domestic arrangement is irregular and that the father's work obligations prevent him from providing adequate direct supervision. Alderman said it with the weariness of a man who'd spent 20 years watching the law used for purposes its writers hadn't intended. In plain language, if Harlan comes here already minded to find a problem, he'll find one. That's how it works. Then what do we do? Elena said. Alderman looked at her. He'd been assessing her since she sat down, in the methodical way of someone building a case. We make sure that when Judge Harlan arrives, what he sees is an orderly, well-functioning household. We make sure the people he speaks to in town don't all belong to Nora Clement's circle. And we make sure he understands that any order separating those children from their home will be contested formally, which costs money and time and makes county officials look like they're troubling a grieving family for the entertainment of local gossips. He paused. That last part I'll communicate through the appropriate channels. Who do we talk to in town? Caleb asked. I have some ideas, Alderman said. The Garretts have no love for Nora Clement since the water rights dispute 2 years ago. Doc Hennessy has been to the ranch. He can speak to the children's health and general welfare. Burl's been your hand for what, 4 years? A man like Burl speaking about the condition of a household carries weight with a judge who came up through ranching country. Elena had been listening and noting, and now she said, What about me specifically? What does Harlan need to see from me? Alderman folded his hands. Honestly, he needs to see that you're not a problem, that you're not there for reasons that don't make sense, that the children are attached to you and not afraid of you, and that the household functions properly. A beat. He also needs to see that Caleb has a coherent answer to the question of what the arrangement is and what it's going to become. There was a silence. Elena didn't look at Caleb. She looked at Alderman. I understand, she said. On the ride back to the ranch, neither of them spoke for a long time. The July evening was warm, the light going gold and long across the grass, and the road ran straight through it in a way that felt like a kind of indifference to everything they were carrying. Finally, Caleb said, I'm sorry. You didn't do anything. I should have... He stopped. The same way he'd stopped before, in the kitchen, saying I should have paid more attention. He had a habit of starting sentences he couldn't finish, which she'd come to understand was because the thing he was actually trying to say was too large for the sentence he'd chosen. I should have made things clearer, in terms of what you are to this family. I left it vague because it was easier to leave it vague. And now, Caleb, she said it quietly, let's get through the next 2 weeks. He looked at her sideways, then he nodded and drove the rest of the way home in silence. And it was a different silence than it had been, more complicated, carrying things that hadn't been said. Judge Harlan arrived on a Wednesday. He was not what Elena had built in her imagination. She'd expected someone in Nora Clement's mold, polished and pointed, but the man who drove up to the ranch house was heavy-set and plainly dressed, with a gray beard and the kind of face that gave nothing away easily. He had a clerk with him, a young man who took notes. He shook Caleb's hand and Elena's hand with equal formality and said he was there to conduct an inquiry into the welfare of the children and hoped it wouldn't take more than the day.
It took most of the day. He walked the property with Caleb. He looked at the house, the kitchen, the sleeping arrangements, the state of the larder. He spoke to Burl, who delivered his assessment of the household in the economy of words that characterized everything Burl did. Place runs fine now, kids are fed, she works hard, no complaints. He spoke to Hector, who was more forthcoming and earnest and probably more helpful for it. He spoke to the children individually, which was the part Elena found hardest to wait through. She stayed in the kitchen with the door open, not listening deliberately, but aware of the sounds. Rose's voice going clearly through the walls, animated and unbothered, the way Rose was about most things. Harlan's measured responses, Owen's briefer, lower contributions to the conversation. Maggie's interview was longer and quieter, and Elena couldn't make out the words, which was probably intentional on Maggie's part.
Afterward, Harlan came into the kitchen where Elena was and sat across from her at the table. His clerk pulled out a chair and positioned his notebook, and Harlan looked at Elena with those close, giving nothing away eyes and said, "Tell me about how you came to be here." She told him, plainly, in the order it happened, without embellishment or apology. The notice, the letter, the train, the first day. He asked questions that were careful and specific. What her duties were, what the arrangement was, how decisions about the children were made, whether she had any financial interest in the property, what she understood her position to be going forward. On that last question, she paused. "I'm here to take care of the household and the children," she said. "Beyond that, I can't tell you what my position is going to be because that hasn't been settled." "Why not?" "Because we've been busy keeping the ranch running and raising 3 children," she said. "We haven't had time to formalize everything that needed formalizing. I imagine that's true of a lot of situations out here." Something moved in Harlan's expression. Not agreement, exactly, but not disagreement either. He wrote something in the notebook. "The children seem well," he said. "The youngest in particular." He paused. "She told me you start the fire every morning because you both wake up early and the house is cold." Elena looked at him. "That's true. She also told me you know which beans are ready to pick and which ones are still thinking about it." He said it without inflection. I wasn't entirely sure what to make of that. "Rose has a theory about beans," Elena said. "She mentioned." He stood up. "I'll be speaking with several people in town tomorrow. I expect to have a determination by the end of the week." He left. Elena stood on the porch and watched the buggy go down the road, and then she sat on the porch steps because her legs had decided they were done cooperating, and she sat there with her hands in her lap until Maggie came and sat beside her. "How do you think it went?" Maggie asked. "I don't know," Elena said honestly. Maggie was quiet. "He asked me if I felt safe," she said. "I told him that was a strange question to ask in my own house." Elena looked at her. "What did he say to that?" "He said it wasn't as strange as I might think." Maggie picked at a loose thread on her sleeve, a gesture she'd picked up from Owen without realizing it, Elena had noticed. "I told him the people trying to take us away were the only ones making me feel unsafe." Elena was quiet for a moment. "You said that?" "Yes." Maggie glanced at her. "Was that wrong?" "No," Elena said. "That was exactly right." Does it? The determination came on Friday, not at the end of the week as Harlan had said, but in the morning, carried by his clerk to the ranch while Harlan himself remained in Caulfield. The clerk was a young man named Thomas, who had the look of someone delivering something he personally wished he wasn't delivering, and he handed the envelope to Caleb at the door with excessive formality and left quickly. Caleb read it at the kitchen table. Elena watched his face while he read it, and she watched it not change, which was worse than if it had. He set the paper down and pushed it across the table to her. The order was 2 pages and full of the particular language that legal documents use to make terrible things sound administrative. The substance of it came down to this. Judge Harlan had determined that the current arrangement was irregular and presented unresolved questions regarding the long-term welfare and appropriate supervision of the minor children. Miss Elena Mercer was to vacate the Whitmore property within 48 hours. Upon her departure, the children would be placed under temporary county supervision to allow for a proper guardianship arrangement to be established. Mr. Whitmore could petition to retain custody of his children, But the petition process would take not less than 30 days and would require... Elena stopped reading. She set the paper down. The kitchen was very quiet. From outside, she could hear Rose in the garden. From somewhere near the barn, Owen's voice talking to Juniper. 48 hours, she said. Yes. And then the children go to Billings. While I petition. Caleb said the word like it was something he'd found on the bottom of his boot. 30 days minimum, it says. Probably longer. Elena thought about Rose in an orphanage in Billings. She thought about Owen, who had only just started talking to people again. She thought about Maggie, who had managed everything alone for over a year and was finally, slowly, learning not to have to. 30 days. More likely 60 or 90, because these things always took longer than they said they would, and the people who made them take longer never had to live inside the waiting. Alderman can contest it, she said. He said it would take time. That's the point. That's what they want. Caleb put his hands flat on the table. If you leave, they might let the petition go through faster. If we fight it, they drag it out, and the children spend all of that in Billings. Elena looked at the paper. She looked at the window, at Rose crouching over her bean plants with the seriousness she brought to them. There was a version of this where she did the practical thing, where she packed her carpet bag, which hadn't gotten any fuller in 9 months. She still had just the one. And she let Caleb handle the petition because he was their father and he could navigate it, and the children would come home eventually and would be all right. Where she left quietly before sunrise so she didn't have to watch the children's faces when she went. Where she spared them the goodbye and the confusion and the grief of another person disappearing from their lives. She'd spent 31 years doing the practical thing, getting by, keeping her head down, accepting what was offered, and not reaching for what wasn't. She looked at the paper for a long time. I'm not leaving, she said. Caleb looked up. I'm not packing my bag and disappearing before dawn so that it's easier for a county judge and Nora Clement. She said it quietly, but there was something iron in it that she hadn't planned but wasn't surprised to find there. If they want me gone, they can come here and tell me to my face and tell those children why, and then Alderman can file his contest and we can let it go to a proper hearing. Caleb was very still. The children will be in the middle of it, he said. Not as an argument, as a fact he needed her to hold. They're already in the middle of it. They were put there by people who don't know them and don't care about them. She met his eyes. What I won't do is let them watch another person leave without explanation. Not again. He looked at her for what felt like a long time. Something was working through his face, not the compressed look she associated with his tiredness, something else, something larger and less managed. Then he said, all right. Just that. All right. And he picked up the order and went to find Alderman. Sab. That evening was the hardest. Caleb told the children about the order at supper because they were going to find out, and it was better from him than from anyone else. And he told them plainly, in the way he told them most hard things, without softening it into something false and without making it larger than it was. There was an order. It said Elena had to leave. They were not going to follow the order. They were going to fight it, and Alderman was already working on it, and they needed everyone to be steady. Rose didn't fully understand. She grasped the part about Elena leaving, and she went white in a way that 4-year-olds go white when something threatens the architecture of their world. And she climbed off her chair and went to Elena and put her arms around Elena's waist and pressed her face against her side and didn't say anything. Elena put her arm around Rose and held her and looked at Caleb over the top of her head. Owen had gone the way he went when things were bad. Inward, face closing down, eyes on the table. But then he looked up directly at Elena and he said, "You're not going." It wasn't a question. "I'm not going," she said. He nodded once and looked back at his plate and picked up his fork. Maggie hadn't said anything yet. She was sitting very straight with her hands in her lap and her face doing the complicated thing it did when she was processing something through all her filters at once. When she finally spoke, she addressed her father. "What do we need to do?" she asked. Caleb looked at his eldest daughter for a moment. "Alderman says a public hearing is our best option. Let the community speak. The people who actually know this family. Make Harlan's order public. Let people see what it says and who asked for it." "A hearing in town," Maggie said, "with people there." Yes, Maggie thought about this. Judith Fitch's father will be there. "He will." "Good," Maggie said.
with a flatness that would have frightened Elena slightly if it had come from an adult. That night, after the children were in bed, Rose had insisted on Elena sitting with her until she fell asleep, which took longer than usual. Her small hand wrapped around Elena's wrist in sleep even after her breathing evened out. Elena came back to the kitchen to find Caleb still at the table.
He'd been there for a while, she could tell. The lamp was lower than it should be. He hadn't refilled his coffee. She sat down across from him. "I need to ask you something," he said. He was looking at the table. His voice had the quality of someone who'd decided to say a thing and was committed to it, but finding the approach difficult. "I should have asked it a long time ago, before it got to this." Elena waited. "When I put that notice in the paper," he said, "I was looking for someone to help with the house and the children. That's what I wrote down, and that's what I meant." Mas trapam chumchatz. He paused. "I didn't write down. I didn't think about." Another stop. He looked up at her. His eyes were the same gray as October sky, and they were direct in a way she'd come to understand was the truest version of him. All the compression and carefulness stripped back, just the actual thing underneath. "You have been more to this family than I asked for or expected, more than I had any right to ask for." "You didn't ask," she said. "I did it. I know." He shifted his weight. This was costing him. She could see that, not because he was ashamed of it, but because he was a man who'd kept things inside for a long time, and the mechanism wasn't smooth anymore. "I need to know if, when this is over, when Alderman gets the order contested, I need to know if you're planning to stay." She looked at him. "I told you I wasn't leaving. Staying to fight the order isn't the same as—" He stopped. Tried again. "Elena, I'm asking if you want to stay. Not because of the order or the children, or because you have nowhere else to go." The hands on the table, flat. "Because you want to be here." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the Montana night was doing what it did. Stars everywhere, the creek sound, the grass moving in whatever breeze came down off the hills. Elena thought about her carpet bag. She thought about the train platform in Hargrove where nobody came to see her off. She thought about Robert Haynes and not quite what they envisioned, and the 4 years of steam and lie at Putnam's Laundry. She thought about Maggie's stitching lesson and Owen's creek stones on the windowsill and Rose's hand around her wrist 20 minutes ago. "I want to be here," she said, simply. No decoration. Caleb looked at her. The thing that had been working through his face all evening, since the order, maybe since before that, maybe for weeks, finally reached some conclusion. "Then let's do this right," he said. "Alderman can file the contest. But I also want there to be a real answer to the question of what you are to this family. Not arrangement, and not housekeeper, and not whatever it is Harlan wrote in his order." He was looking at her with the directness that was his truest mode. "I'm not good at saying things like this. I know I'm not. Catherine used to tell me I'd sooner fix a fence than have a hard conversation, and she wasn't wrong." "She sounds like she knew you well," Elena said. "She did." He said it without flinching, without the weight of guilt he might have carried, but didn't seem to. I'm not trying to replace what that was. I'm saying something different. I'm saying that in 9 months you have become—" He stopped. His jaw set. He started again. "I would like you to stay, permanently. As my wife, if you're willing. Because this family is better with you in it, and I don't want to spend another day pretending I haven't noticed that." The lamp flickered slightly. Elena sat with what he'd said for a moment, not to make him wait, but because it had arrived at a place she hadn't let herself look at directly, the place where the creek stones and the stitching and Rose's hand at her wrist had been accumulating meaning she hadn't named. "That's a practical reason," she said finally. "It's not the only one. I know." She looked at him. "I'm not saying no. I'm saying not yet. Let's get through the hearing first. Let's let Harlan see what this family is in public, with people around, and let's contest his order properly, and then—" She paused. "Then ask me again." He was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded. "All right." "That's your word," she said. "All right. It's a useful word," he said. And for the first time in a long time, in the low lamplight of a difficult night, there was something almost like humor in it. They had 48 hours, and Alderman worked through both of them. By the following morning, he had filed a formal contest of Harlan's order with the county court, which temporarily suspended the removal requirement pending a public hearing. By afternoon, he had confirmed that the hearing would be held in Caulfield's Assembly Hall, the largest indoor space the town had, used for meetings and elections, and the occasional dispute that outgrew wherever it started. Harlan was obligated to attend. The community was entitled to speak. Alderman came to the ranch that evening to walk them through it, sitting at the kitchen table with his papers spread around him and the children present because Elena had asked that they be included rather than managed around. He explained what would happen, what could be said, what carried weight with a county judge in a public proceeding and what didn't. Maggie listened with both hands flat on the table and her eyes moving between Alderman and her father. When he finished, she said, "Can I speak?" Alderman looked at her. "You're 11. "I know how old I am," Maggie said. Alderman looked at Caleb. Caleb said nothing and kept his face neutral, which was its own kind of answer. Alderman looked back at Maggie. "Yes," he said. "You can speak," Owen said from the corner where he'd been sitting with his knees up and his back against the wall. "Me too." It was perhaps the most words he'd said in one sitting since Elena arrived. She didn't react. She looked at her hands and let it be ordinary. "The children will speak," Alderman said. He made a note. "Right. Let's go through what we're going to say." They went through it for 2 hours, and it was after 9 when Alderman left, and the children were exhausted, and Rose had fallen asleep on the bench with her head on Elena's arm, and Caleb carried her to bed while Maggie and Owen helped clear the table of Alderman's papers. When Owen passed Elena on his way to bed, he stopped and said, without looking at her, "You should have the stones." She looked at him. The creek stones had been on the windowsill for months. "They're yours," she said. "I know." He still wasn't looking at her. "I'm giving them to you for—" He seemed to be searching for the reason and couldn't find the right words, so he just said, "You should have them." He went to bed. Elena stood by the windowsill and looked at the smooth, flat stones for a moment. The ones you could skip if you had the right angle and a calm piece of water and a good arm. She picked them up and held them, and they were cold from the window glass, and real in the way that plain, ordinary things are real. Not symbolic, not momentous, just a boy's creek stones that he'd decided to give her. And her standing in a kitchen in Montana holding them, with a hearing in 2 days and everything uncertain, and the ranch quiet around her and the family she'd built out of nothing but showing up, sleeping. The hearing was in 2 days. She put the stones in her coat pocket, where she would feel their weight every time she reached for anything, and she turned off the lamp and went to bed. The morning of the hearing, Elena woke before the sky had decided what color it was going to be. She lay still for a moment in the gray pre-dawn, listening to the ranch breathe around her. The creak of the house in the early cold, the distant sound of cattle, the creek running its usual low argument with the rocks in its bed. 9 months she'd been waking to these sounds, and they'd gone from foreign to familiar so gradually she couldn't pinpoint when the shift had happened. Somewhere between the first frost and the south fence getting done. Somewhere between Owen's first unprompted sentence at the supper table and Rose's theory about beans. You don't notice the moment a place becomes yours. You just notice one day that it already is. She got up and built the fire and put the kettle on and stood at the kitchen window watching the sky go from gray to the particular pale gold of a Montana July morning, and she put her hand in her coat pocket and felt the creek stones Owen had given her, cold and smooth, and she thought about what this day was going to ask of all of them. The hearing was at 10 o'clock in the Assembly Hall on Caulfield's main street. That gave them 4 hours. Rose appeared first, as usual, her hair still loose from sleep, her nightgown wrinkled. She climbed onto the bench beside Elena without preamble and looked at the window with the contemplative expression she got in the mornings before she'd fully committed to being awake. "Is today the day?" she asked. "Yes," Elena said. Rose thought about this. "Are you scared?" Elena looked at her honestly. "A little." "Me too." Rose leaned against Elena's arm. "But Maggie says we're going to win." "Maggie said that?" "She said it last night to Owen when she thought I was asleep." Rose paused. "I wasn't asleep." "No," Elena said. "I didn't think you were." They sat together while the kitchen warmed around them, and Elena poured warm milk for Rose and coffee for herself, and they didn't talk much more because the morning didn't require it. This was something Elena had come to understand about Rose, that she suspected would stay true as Rose grew, that the girl had a capacity for comfortable quiet that most people twice her age hadn't developed, an ability to be present in a space without needing to fill it. Catherine had given her that, maybe, or maybe Rose had simply been born with it. Either way, it was a gift. Caleb came in at 6:30 from his morning check on the herd. He'd been up at 4, she'd heard him. And he poured his coffee and sat at the table and looked at the two of them with the expression that Elena had learned to read over these months. Not sentiment exactly, something more private than that, something he kept close. "How do you want to do this?" he asked. Meaning the morning, the preparations, the getting there. "We get dressed," Elena said. "We eat, we go." He nodded. That was enough. Maggie came to Elena's room while Elena was pinning her hair and knocked twice on the open door. "Come in," Elena said. Maggie came in and stood near the window, the east-facing one, the one Elena had thought about on her first night here, wondering what she'd gotten herself into. Maggie was already dressed, her hair braided back with a neatness that must have taken considerable effort, wearing the dark blue dress she saved for occasions. "I want to tell you something before we go," Maggie said. She was looking at the window, not at Elena. This was how Maggie said hard things, sideways, eyes elsewhere, as though the words were easier to release if she wasn't watching them land. "All right," Elena said. "When you first came," Maggie stopped, collected herself. "When you first came, I decided I wasn't going to let you matter, because everyone was always sorry about us, and coming to help, and then leaving, and I was tired of being someone people felt sorry for." She turned from the window and looked at Elena directly, which meant she'd gotten to the part she needed to say face to face. "You didn't feel sorry for us. You were just here, and you kept being here. And I kept waiting for you to leave, and you didn't, and eventually I stopped waiting." Elena set down her hairpins. "I know what it cost you," Maggie said, "to come out here with nothing and just decide to stay. I know that's not a small thing." "It wasn't nothing," Elena said quietly. "I had 43 cents and a train ticket." Something cracked open in Maggie's expression, something young and unguarded that she usually kept further back. "That's basically nothing." "It is basically nothing," Elena agreed. Maggie pressed her lips together. Her eyes were bright in a way she was clearly managing. "I just wanted to say, before we go in there today, that whatever happens, you're—" She stopped. 11 years old and looking for the word that was large enough. "You're ours," she said finally. "That's what I wanted to say. You're ours and we're not letting anyone tell us different." Elena crossed the room and put her arms around Maggie, who was stiff for exactly 1 second and then wasn't, who pressed her face against Elena's shoulder and held on with both hands the way she probably hadn't held on to anyone since her mother died. And Elena held her and didn't say anything because there was nothing to say that was better than just holding on. After a moment, Maggie pulled back and straightened and looked at her own hands, composing herself with the discipline she brought to everything. "Okay," she said, like the matter was settled, like she'd filed it and moved to the next item. "Okay," Elena said. They went to have breakfast. Cool. The assembly hall was more full than Elena had anticipated. She'd expected a crowd. Alderman had told them to expect a crowd, had said that public hearings in small towns drew people the way bad weather drew commentary because both gave you something outside your own life to look at and have opinions about. But the hall was packed in a way that went beyond curiosity, beyond the social pull of a spectacle. People were standing along the walls. Elena recognized faces as they came in. Doc Hennessy near the front, Burl in his good coat looking profoundly uncomfortable about it, Hector with his hat in his hands, the Garrett family taking up half a row. There were people she didn't recognize, and people she recognized and didn't much like, including Vera Goddard in the 4th row with the expression of someone at a particularly interesting theater performance. Nora Clement was near the front on the opposite side, her back straight, her face composed. She looked at Elena when Elena came in and her expression didn't change at all, which was its own kind of statement. Judge Harlan sat at the table at the front of the hall, his clerk beside him with a fresh notebook. He looked, if anything, more expressionless than he had at the ranch. Elena couldn't read whether that was good or bad and stopped trying. Caleb walked in with the children, and Elena walked beside them, and she felt the hall's attention move to them and settle there. And she kept her eyes forward and her pace steady, and her hand found Rose's hand without looking, and Rose held on. They sat in the front row. Alderman was already there, his papers organized. He leaned over and said, low, "Good turnout. Better than I expected." "Is that good?" Caleb asked. "Depends on what they say," Alderman said honestly. "But yes, generally." Harlan called the hearing to order at 10:05 and explained its purpose in the careful language of someone who wanted everything on the record to be precise. This was a public inquiry into the welfare of the minor Whitmore children and the contested removal order, and all persons wishing to speak on the matter were invited to do so in turn, and the court would take all testimony under advisement before issuing a final determination. Then he asked if anyone wished to begin. It was Doc Hennessy who stood up first, which Elena hadn't expected. He was a compact, direct man of about 55 who had delivered Rose and set Owen's broken arm the winter before last, and had visited the ranch twice in the past 9 months. Once when Rose had a fever that scared all of them for 2 days, and once when Burl had cut his hand badly on wire and needed stitching. He hadn't volunteered an opinion on anything while he was there. He'd done his work and left. He stood up now and he said, without preamble, "I've been the doctor for this county for 16 years. I've been to that ranch twice since Miss Mercer arrived. Both times those children were healthy, clean, and well-fed. The younger two in particular showed improvement from what I'd seen the year before." He paused. "The year before, when I visited, those children were grieving and underfed and the household was not functioning. I'm not saying that to criticize Mr. Whitmore, who was managing a serious loss and a working ranch simultaneously. I'm saying it because the comparison is relevant." He looked at Harlan. "I see no medical or welfare grounds for the order." He sat down. Vera Goddard's husband, who had apparently been persuaded to come despite or because of Vera, stood up next and said something about community standards and appropriate arrangements that had the shape of concern but the substance of nothing in particular, and Alderman made a note and let it go. Then Jim Garrett stood up. He was a rancher of about Caleb's age, with a sun-weathered face and the economy of movement of someone who spent most of his life outdoors, and he said, "I've been Caleb Whitmore's neighbor for 8 years. Last winter, when we had the bad cold snap, I lost 7 head, and Caleb came over with 2 of his hands to help me with the rest at 2 in the morning. No reason except that's what you do out here. His ranch runs better this year than it has in 2 years. His herd is up, and every time I've seen those kids, they look like kids who are being taken care of." He glanced at Elena. "I don't know Miss Mercer well, but I know that ranch, and I know that family, and I know what it looked like before, and I know what it looks like now. Whatever she's doing out there, it's working." He sat back down, and his wife, a woman named Frances, who had once brought Elena a jar of preserved plums at Christmas for no stated reason, reached over and patted his arm. Then Harlan said, "I understand the children's eldest wished to speak." The hall went quiet in the particular way of a room that has just recalibrated its attention. Maggie stood up. She was 11 years old, and she was wearing her dark blue dress, and her hair was braided back, and she stood with her hands at her sides. And she did not look at Nora Clement, and she did not look at Vera Goddard, and she did not look at the assembled Caulfield population that had turned out to watch her family be weighed and judged. She looked at Judge Harlan. "My name is Margaret Whitmore," she said. Her voice was clear and entirely steady. "Everyone calls me Maggie. I'm 11. Harlan nodded once. "Go ahead, Maggie." "My mother died 14 months ago," Maggie said. "Before she died, I watched her get sick for almost a year, and I watched my father take care of her and the ranch at the same time, and I watched my brother stop talking and my sister stop understanding why the house was different. And then she was gone, and we were still here, and we had to keep going." She paused. Not for effect, just because she'd gotten to a part that needed care. After she died, 2 different women came to try to help. Neither of them stayed. And I understood that because it's a hard place and we're not an easy family and there was a lot wrong with everything at that point. I understood it. But every time someone left, it got harder to believe anyone would stay. The hall was completely still. "Elena came in October," Maggie said. "She had 1 bag. She didn't know how the stove worked. She burned the biscuits the first time she made them,
and she was angry at herself about it for longer than she needed to be. A pause. She stayed. Through the whole winter, through my brother not talking, and my sister asking for our mother and my father being... She glanced at Caleb, and something passed between them that was entirely private. My father being someone who was carrying a lot.
She stayed through all of it, and things got better. Not because she fixed everything, she didn't, but because she was there every morning and every night, and she didn't leave. Maggie looked at Harlan steadily. You asked me if I felt safe. I told you that was a strange question to ask in my own house. I want to explain what I meant by that. I meant that the only thing that has made me feel unsafe in the past 14 months is the idea of Elena leaving. That is the only thing. She let that sit for a moment. The people who asked you to come here don't know my family. They've never sat at our table or worked in our kitchen or watched my brother talk to the horses because he couldn't talk to people yet. They saw an arrangement that looked irregular from the outside, and they decided they understood it. They don't. She stopped. I do, and I'm asking you to listen to me instead of them. She sat down. The hall made a sound that wasn't quite sound, more like a collective shift, a held breath released unevenly across the room. Elena stared at her hands in her lap. Beside her, Caleb was very still. On Maggie's other side, Owen reached over without looking and briefly put his hand over his sister's, and Maggie turned her palm up and held it, and then they both let go because they were both too old for it to last longer than that. Harlan wrote something. His expression hadn't changed, but there was something different in the set of his jaw. Owen stood up next. He said less than Maggie. He always said less than everyone, but he stood up and looked at the judge and said, She's the one who noticed Juniper was favoring her leg before I did, and she didn't even say anything about it. She just told my father quietly so he could look at it. That's not... You don't do that if you're just there for the ranch. He stopped, apparently satisfied that he'd said the thing he'd come to say, and sat back down. There was a beat of quiet in which no one seemed quite sure how to follow that, and then a woman's voice from the middle of the hall said, Can I speak? It was Frances Garrett. She stood up without waiting for Harlan's nod, which was either boldness or the country habit of not standing much on ceremony. I'm not going to make a speech, she said. I just want to say that I've watched this family from a neighbor's distance for the past year. And I've watched those kids go from children who looked lost to children who look like themselves again. And I don't think Nora Clement, who has never raised a child that wasn't already grown when she came into its life, is in a position to tell a family what their welfare looks like from the inside. She sat down. Her husband looked straight ahead with the face of a man who has learned, over the course of a long marriage, not to react. Nora Clement rose then, composed and measured, and made her case with the thoroughness Elena had already credited her for. She spoke about proper arrangements and the county's duty of care and the importance of establishing clear legal frameworks for children in non-standard situations, and she said it all without ever being technically wrong about any of it. The code she was citing existed. The questions she was raising were real questions. What she never said, because she couldn't, was why she cared. What she never acknowledged was that the children she was so concerned about were sitting 10 feet away, listening to her speak about them like figures in an administrative problem. When she finished and sat down, Rose, who had been very good for a very long time, said in her clear, carrying voice, That lady never even came to our house. There was a ripple through the hall that was somewhere between laughter and discomfort. Caleb put his hand on Rose's shoulder. Rose looked up at him and apparently decided from his expression that this was not the moment for further editorial comment. Harlan cleared his throat. Is there anything else? Alderman stood up and made his formal argument, clean, precise, walking through the legal grounds for contesting the order, the procedural questions about the relationship between Harlan and Nora Clement, the lack of specific evidence of harm to the children, the testimony of the county's own medical officer. He was not dramatic. He didn't need to be. He laid it out and sat down. And then Harlan said, Mr. Whitmore. Caleb stood up. He stood with his hat in his hands, turning it once, a rare tell, a crack in the composure he wore like a second skin. And then he stopped turning it and held it still, and he looked at Harlan. I'm not a man who talks much, he said. People who know me will confirm that, so I'll keep this short. He paused. My wife died, and I nearly lost everything. Not the ranch, but the things that made the ranch worth having. My children spent a year half buried in grief, and I didn't know how to dig them out because I was buried myself. He didn't say this with self-pity. He said it as a man giving a fair account of facts. Elena Mercer came here with almost nothing, and she worked harder than I had any right to expect, and she stayed when she had every reason to leave. And my children are standing here today. Standing here, speaking up for themselves, doing what my daughter just did in front of all of you. Because she was there. He looked at Harlan without looking away. You can look at the arrangement from the outside and decide it's irregular. I'm telling you from the inside that it is the best thing that has happened to my family in 2 years. And I'm asking you to dismiss your order and let us go home. He sat down. Harlan made a note. He looked at his notes for a long moment. He looked at the hall. I'll take a recess, he said. Sit. They waited in the hall while he went to the small room behind the speaker's table that served as a judge's chamber when the assembly hall was used for legal purposes. The crowd around them didn't leave. A few people stepped outside, but most stayed, standing in clusters, talking in the low voices of people who know they're in the middle of something that isn't finished. Elena sat between Caleb and Rose with Owen on Rose's other side and Maggie beside Caleb, and she looked at the far wall of the hall, which had a long crack in the plaster that ran from the ceiling to about halfway down. And she thought, whatever happens next, these children said those things publicly, and nobody can take that back. Maggie stood up in front of this entire town and said, you're ours with different words but the same meaning, and that exists now. That is real. It was 22 minutes. She counted. When Harlan came back out, the hall resettled quickly, with the efficient attention of a room that's been waiting and is ready to be done with it. I've reviewed my original determination and the testimony presented today, Harlan said. He said it with the same expressionless precision he'd used all morning. The order I issued was based on concerns about the welfare of the minor children and the regularity of the domestic arrangement at the Whitmore property. Having heard from the county physician, from neighboring ranchers with direct knowledge of the family's circumstances, and from the children themselves, he paused briefly. I find that the concerns cited in the original order are not substantiated by the evidence presented. The welfare of the children is not in question. The domestic arrangement, while informal, has demonstrably served their interests. He set down his papers. The order is dismissed. 3 words. The order is dismissed. Rose said, what does that mean? Owen said, it means we won. Rose processed this for half a second and then made a sound that was entirely unlike anything a formal proceeding normally contained, and the hall, which had held its breath for 22 minutes, let it go all at once. Outside in the July heat, with the main street of Caulfield busy around them, Caleb stood with Elena while the children were somewhere behind them, and Alderman was shaking hands with someone, and Burl was making his wordless way back toward the livery. It's done, Caleb said. It's done, Elena agreed. He looked at her. He still had his hat in his hands. I meant what I said in there. I know you did. And I meant what I asked you the other night. He was looking at her directly, in the mode that was his truest mode. No management or compression, just the actual thing. I said I'd ask again after the hearing. Elena looked at him. This man who'd sent a rough letter to a woman he'd never met because he was out of options and honest enough to say so. This man who'd let her stand beside him at a fence line without making a production of it. Who'd said I was worried about Rose most in the past tense, like a thing that was beginning to resolve. Who'd turned the hat in his hands exactly once and then made himself stop. He was not a perfect man. He was a man who compressed himself under pressure and went quiet when talking would have helped, and had spent 14 months so buried in his own grief that the people around him had needed to find their own way through theirs. He was a man still learning how to reach for something after losing the thing he'd built his life around, which meant he reached slowly and with visible effort, and it didn't always come out right. But he showed up. Every day he showed up, at 4 a.m, and at midnight, and in the middle of things, and at the end of things, and Elena understood now, in a way she hadn't when she was young and waiting for something to present itself, that showing up was the whole of it. That was the thing. Everything else was built on top of that one unglamorous fact. Yes, she said. My answer is yes. Something moved through his face. Relief, and something more complicated than relief. Something that had been held in reserve for a long time and was just now being allowed to exist. He didn't say anything immediately. He just nodded,
the same decisive nod Maggie had inherited from him. And then he looked at the hat in his hands and seemed to remember it was there and put it back on. Then he said, "Maggie's going to need to be told properly. Not just told, she'll have opinions."
"She always has opinions," Elena said. "Owen will probably express himself by finding you something from a creek bed." "I have a collection already." Something that was actually a smile crossed his face. Brief and unprepared, the same kind she'd heard escaped him in January. "I know. I noticed." Behind them, Rose came running out of the hall and threw herself at Elena's back with the full, unguarded force of a 4-year-old who'd been sitting still for too long. And Elena caught her and swung her up, and Rose grabbed her face with both small hands the way she did when she had something important to say and needed to make sure she had your full attention. "Maggie says we're going home," Rose said. "We're going home," Elena confirmed. "And you're staying." "I'm staying." Rose examined her face from a distance of approximately 4 inches with the thoroughness she brought to beans and slug management and all other matters of importance, apparently satisfied herself that this was true, and then buried her face in Elena's neck and held on. They married in September, when the aspens were going gold in the draws, and the air had the particular clarity that comes in the first weeks of Montana fall. It was a small thing. Alderman, who had a notary's authority, handled the legal portion, and the Garretts came, and Burl stood in the yard looking as uncomfortable as he had at the hearing, and Hector cried a little and didn't apologize for it. Maggie had opinions about Elena's hair, which she expressed by arriving in Elena's room the morning of, with a comb and a set of pins and a look that brooked no argument. She worked with the concentrated focus she brought to the accounts and the stitching, and when she was done, she stepped back and examined her work and said, "You should wear your hair like this more often." "I'll take that under consideration," Elena said. Maggie caught her eye in the small mirror and looked away quickly, but not before Elena saw her expression, proud and private, and maybe, around the edges, something that was starting to look like peace. Owen gave Elena a river stone the morning of the wedding. A different one, rounder and darker than the others, from the deeper part of the creek where the water ran cold even in summer. He set it on the kitchen table when she was making breakfast and said, "For the collection," and went outside. Elena put it in her pocket with the others and said nothing because nothing was what the moment wanted. Rose asked at breakfast if she could call Elena Mama now. The kitchen went very quiet. Elena looked at Rose. She looked at Caleb, who was looking at his coffee with his face doing the thing it did when he was letting her lead. She thought about Catherine Whitmore, whose house this was and always would be in some essential way, whose blue cups Maggie still put out on Sundays, whose braiding technique Elena had learned from Maggie without realizing it, whose presence lived in the particular way these children loved and grieved and held on. She thought about the fact that Mama already meant something in this family that she hadn't put there and couldn't replace and didn't want to. "You can call me whatever feels right to you," she told Rose. "There's no rule." Rose considered this with the seriousness she brought to all things. "I'll call you Mama," she decided. "Mama Catherine is in the pictures. You're the one here." It was the logic of a 4-year-old, and it was also, Elena thought, a kind of wisdom that people older than 4 spent their whole lives trying to arrive at. The one who's here. That was it. That was the whole of it. "Okay," Elena said. "That works for me." Chat. There are things you can only see clearly from a distance, and the truth about belonging is one of them. When you're inside the wanting of it, it looks like a destination, a place you'll arrive at, a door that will finally open, a moment when something clicks into place, and you know you found the thing you were looking for. It doesn't feel like that from the inside. From the inside, it feels like getting up before the sky has decided what color it's going to be, and building a fire and waiting for a 4-year-old who doesn't sleep late. It feels like burned biscuits and a crooked line of stitching and a boy's creek stones on a windowsill. It feels like showing up again and again to something that isn't easy and doesn't ask you to be more than you are. Elena Mercer had spent 31 years believing that belonging was something assigned, something you were granted by the right circumstances or the right people or the right moment of luck. She'd waited for it to be conferred. It never was, and she'd been starting to think that was something about her specifically, some quality she lacked that made her unassignable. She'd been wrong. Not about being overlooked. She had been overlooked. She'd been passed over and turned away and left off people's lists of people who mattered, and that was real, and it had cost her something real. She'd been wrong about what the solution to it was. The belonging she'd been waiting to receive was the one she'd been building all along. In the hours of showing up, in the meals and the mending, and the fence posts and the honest conversation across a cold kitchen table. It wasn't given. It was made, daily, out of ordinary materials, by people who were tired and imperfect and sometimes burned the biscuits and lost their tempers and cried in the pantry for 5 minutes, and then came back out and kept going. That's what nobody tells you. They talk about belonging like it's a place you find. It's not. It's a thing you build. By the following spring, the herd was at 110. By the spring after that, it was 130, and they hired a third hand, a taciturn man from Wyoming named Estes, who got along well with Burl and taught Owen how to read tracks, which became an occupation Owen treated with the dedication he brought to everything he loved. Maggie at 12 was ferocious and fair and ran the household accounts with a precision that would have embarrassed most adults, and she'd started corresponding with a woman in Billings who ran a school and had opinions about educating girls that aligned closely with the opinions Maggie was developing about herself. She still corrected Elena's stitching. Elena still let her. Rose at 5 had abandoned her theory that beings were sentient, or rather had suspended it pending further evidence, which Elena thought was a scientifically reasonable position. She could already read, Maggie had taught her, with the thoroughness of a born teacher, and she had taken to following Estes around asking him questions about tracking that he answered with more patience than he probably had for most adults. Owen turned 10 in January and didn't say much about it, but he spent the morning of his birthday teaching Elena the proper way to check a horse's foreleg for strain, talking more in that 2 hours than he sometimes talked in a week, and she paid close attention and asked questions that were genuine, and afterward he said, "You're better at it than I thought you'd be," which was, from Owen, roughly equivalent to a standing ovation. Nora Clement did not come to the wedding and was not invited. Vera Goddard sent a note afterward that was politely worded and that Elena read once, set aside, and didn't think about again. Not because she was above it, but because she genuinely didn't have time. There was too much to do. There always was. That was the other thing nobody told you, that the life you were trying to build didn't pause while you were building it. It kept going, demanding things of you, throwing weather and sick cattle and broken hinges and children who cried in the night. And you dealt with those things. And in the dealing, you became, slowly and without fanfare, the person who dealt with them, the person who was there. On a Tuesday evening in October, almost exactly 2 years after Elena Mercer had stepped off a train with a carpet bag and 43 cents and a folded newspaper clipping, she sat on the porch of her ranch and watched the last of the day go out of the sky. It went in layers, orange to gold to a deep bruised blue that she'd come to think of as the particular color of this place, of Montana autumn evenings, of home. Caleb came and sat beside her. From inside the house, she could hear Maggie helping Rose with something that had recently become educational, by the sound of it. A lesson of some kind, Maggie's voice carrying the precise quality it took on when she was explaining something she considered important. From the barn, faintly, Owen's voice. The horses shifting. "Long day," Caleb said. "Long day," Elena agreed. He put his arm around her, which he'd gotten better at. Not easy exactly, still deliberate in the way some things remain deliberate, no matter how much you practice them, but real and without apology. "Burl thinks the winter's coming in early," he said. "Burl thinks every winter is coming in early." "He's right about half the time." "That's better than average," Elena said. The sky did what it did. The creek ran below the house, finding its argument with its rocks. The same argument it had been having since before any of them arrived, and would keep having after. The grass moved. The cattle were shapes in the lower pasture. Inside, Rose laughed at something. The full, clear laugh that had been one of the first good signs. Back in those early weeks, the sound that said, "Here is a child who is not broken. Here is a child who will be all right." Elena sat on her porch in the last of the light and felt the weight of the creek stones in her coat pocket, smooth and cold, and she thought, "This is what I came out here with nothing to find. Not the ranch. Not a husband or a title or a resolution to the problem of being unwanted. Just this, to be the person who was here. To have built something real out of showing up day after day in a hard place with hard people who were also, underneath the hardness, just people trying to keep going. She'd been 31 years old with nowhere to be. Now she was somewhere. It wasn't perfect. It was better than that. It was true.